So, what happens when a president's absolute favorite economic tool goes head to head with the 9 justices of the Supreme Court? Well, we're about to find out. A massive ruling just came down that takes aim at one of Donald Trump's signature policies, and it sent political shockwaves everywhere. Let's break down exactly what happened and what it really means for the separation of powers.
Look, to really get this story, you have to understand one thing about former President Trump's economic playbook. It all comes back to his go-to tool, what he himself has called his favorite word, tariffs. Use them all the time, really aggressively, to try and reshape trade deals and push his America First agenda. But now, the Supreme Court has basically thrown up a giant roadblock on that America First highway. So the big question is, how did we even get here? And, more importantly, is this actually the end of the road for his tariff strategy, or is it just a detour? Let's dive in.
Okay, first up, let's look at the ruling itself. And you should know, this was not a squeaker, not a close call at all. It was a pretty decisive 6-3 decision that directly challenged the authority the president had been using to make all this happen.
The whole case, the entire thing really hinged on this one specific law, the Emergency Powers Law. The administration's argument was that this law gave them the green light to impose these huge, sweeping tariffs by basically framing unfair trade practices as a kind of national emergency.
But the Supreme Court? They disagreed. Big time. The final vote was 6-3. A really clear majority decided that, nope, this particular law could not be used this way. And that single vote count? It sent instant shockwaves all through Washington.
And that, of course, brings us to the fallout. As you can probably guess, the political reaction was swift, it was sharp, and boy was it divided.
Former President Trump, for his part, did not hold back at all. He said he was deeply disappointed and even ashamed of some of the justices. He really framed this as a loss for America and a win for other countries.
And then on the other side, the reaction was just as forceful. You had California Governor Gavin Newsom saying it was time to pay the piper, calling the tariffs an illegal cash grab that hurt American families. It really shows you that sense of vindication his critics felt.
And that feeling was pretty much echoed across the board by other Democrats. They called the ruling good news for the American economy and an important reminder that a president isn't unstoppable. The message was clear. You need to listen to the Supreme Court. So you might be thinking, okay, was this ruling a fatal blow to the tariff policy, or was it just a procedural hurdle? Well, the administration's very next move suggests it was probably the latter, because they immediately pivoted their strategy. And this is where the legal strategy gets pretty clever. Since they couldn't use that broad emergency powers law anymore, the administration just reached for a different tool in the toolbox, the Trade Act of 1974. Now, the key difference here is that the Trade Act requires a formal investigation before you can implement targeted tariffs. You can't just do those sweeping across-the-board ones anymore. One panelist, Jesse Waters, really put this shift into perspective with a great analogy. He said it's like telling a landscaper, hey, you can't use a leaf blower anymore, you have to use a rake. It's going to take a little bit longer, sure, but you're still going to accomplish the same thing. The leaf blower is gone, but the rake still works just fine. So the main takeaway for policy supporters was pretty obvious. This was not the end of tariffs, not by a long shot. It was just a change in the legal tactics you have to use to get to the exact same goal. Of course, behind all this legal and political maneuvering, there is a really fierce debate about the actual economics of tariffs. The big question, do they help the country or do they hurt it? So people who support tariffs, they point to this number right here, $175 billion. That's how much revenue the government has collected. They argue this money gives them leverage in trade talks, and it's a critical tool for economic national security. But, and this is a big but, critics point to a number that hits a little closer to home. They argue that about 90% of the cost of these tariffs gets passed directly onto you, the consumer, adding up to what they estimate was an extra $1,000 burden for the average American household last year alone. So this really brings us to the heart of the conflict. On one side, you've got the argument that tariffs are this powerful tool for creating leverage and boosting American manufacturing. And on the other side, they're seen as basically a hidden tax on American families that damages our global relationships and just invites lawsuits. And beyond all the economics, this case really raises a huge fundamental question about the balance of power in our government. Where does a president's authority actually end, and where does Congress's begin?
In his concurring opinion, Justice Neil Gorsuch really drilled down on this exact concern. He pointed out that the Constitution explicitly gives Congress, not the president, the power to regulate commerce and to tax, and he warned against any president using emergency powers to just bypass Congress. Now, it is so important to point out that this whole strategy of finding a legal workaround after a Supreme Court loss, that is not a partisan thing. It's not just one party that does it. The Biden administration, for example, did something very similar. They looked for alternative routes for both student loan forgiveness and vaccine policies right after the court struck down their initial plans. It just shows a broader pattern we're seeing with modern presidents really testing the boundaries of their power. And all of this leaves us with this final, really crucial question. This ruling on tariffs, it's not just about one policy. It's about this constant push and pull between the White House, Congress, and the courts. It really forces us all to ask, when the court makes a decision, where does a president's power actually end? And where does that search for a workaround begin? That's a question worth thinking about. Thanks for tuning in.